So today we're here for Francesca Froy's pre-launch of her new book, Rebuilding Urban Complexity. There is this vouchers on your chair where you'll be able to buy the book if you're looking for a hard copy, but you'll also be happy to hear that it's available to download from our libraries right now, already available for you to download and read at your leisure. So thank you, Francesca, for inviting me to this role to interview you so that we can all learn a bit more about your book. So very brief words about myself and Francesca. So my name is Patricia Canellas. I am a departmental lecturer here for the program, the MSc in Sustainable Urban Development. I'm also currently the course director. And Francesca Froy is also a departmental lecturer here for the Masters in Sustainable Urban Development at Continuing Education, Oxford University. So with this very brief introductions, I'll just say we have an audience in the room, but we're also recording. That's why I'm perhaps still debating where to look, but I will prefer to look at the audience rather than the camera. And with this introduction, the structure for this 45-minute presentation is we're going to cover, we have a structure of 4 sort of questions. And the questions are, what is the book about? Why? The key findings or key messages, and then a very academic, so what final question. I think Francesca wants it to be as sort of conversational as possible. So feel free to perhaps cover the 4 main points first, and then we'll open up for the debate if that's all right with everyone. So Francesca, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming. I really wanted to do this event this week because this is our 7th week together as a cohort, actually, and I thought it would be such a shame not to have an opportunity to share the book with you. So there is another launch at the Bartlett in a few weeks' time, and you're extremely welcome to come to that too. There's going to be a panel discussion with different academics that I've worked with on these issues for a while, so it'll be slightly different in format. But it's just really nice to have an opportunity to have a more informal discussion, and I'd love to have your questions, including any questions about publishing, actually. If you're interested in what it's like to write a book and how you engage with a publisher, we could probably come to that at the end. So the book, this is a kind of labour of love. It's my PhD thesis, actually, really at heart. So I kind of came back to academia after quite a long time working as a policymaker. And I realised that some of the policy advice that we were giving out to people, mainly in cities and towns around the world who were trying to do local economic development, some of the policy advice we were given was quite generic, really. A lot of the people we were talking to didn't seem to really have an understanding of the complexity, but also of the potentials, the latent potentials in their particular town and city. What the capabilities were, what the street structure was, how the built environment was shaping the way that that place was evolving over time. And so I wanted to come back to academia and study all that stuff. So I kind of came back to do a PhD at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL. And started to write this book, which is essentially a book about urban complexity. So when it was a PhD, it was arranged slightly differently. I finished the PhD in 2021 and then had a bit of a break and then came back to it, kind of rearranged the structure. But essentially, I'm really talking about the evolution and then destruction of urban complexity in one city, in Manchester. And I'm then comparing it to other post-industrial cities. So I also talk in the book about Newcastle and Sheffield in the north of England, and also compare with places like New Haven and Detroit in the United States. So I hope that summarises, just to start with, what the book is about. It starts off defining urban complexity, and then it's in 3 parts, actually. So it looks at part-whole relationships in cities, spatial and economic. Then it looks at processes of evolution and branching and how complexity builds and then declines. And then the last part is looking at how cities function as systems of systems. So also bringing in other systems like natural and biodiverse-based systems and thinking about social systems. So it kind of looks at complexity from different angles, but all framed around concrete examples from cities.
Okay, thank you for that great summary. So why is sort of the next question? Why writing a book out of your PhD dissertation?
So yeah, when I was working in policy, I realized that it's not only that often people working in local development don't really understand the particular economic or spatial structure of where they're living, but they don't necessarily identify the interdependencies either. So, for example, if you're looking at local economic policies, often you'll think about one sector like steel or textiles, or if you're looking at a spatial question, you might look at one local area. You won't necessarily understand that cities are these very, I mean, Jane Jacobs called it that these examples of organized complexity. They're very relational places. So if you're looking at one sector, chances are that that sector has evolved over time in co-evolution with other sectors. And you actually need to understand how different industrial sectors might be sharing labor and skills and knowledge in a place and how that's evolved over time. You need to understand how spatially, as a place has developed, each street has developed in relation to a much broader networked system. So you can't understand one part of that spatial structure without understanding its interrelationship to the whole. So I think the book is a way of exposing this kind of complexity and also helping people to understand the cost of destroying the complexity. Because I came looking at Manchester, I could really see how it evolved as an economic city since the Industrial Revolution and how it diversified and branched over time. I could see how the street system had evolved incrementally from the same period, getting more complex, but maintaining a real integrity in a way, a kind of network-based, urban, gritty, terrace street type city. That had this kind of backbone of key streets that were joining everything together, bringing people into the centre of the city, promoting trade, but also promoting all these economic interdependencies, I think, because allowing people to encounter each other, to interact, creating this space that was somehow coherent. But that actually at a certain point post-war, when manufacturing started to decline, because Manchester was a very manufacturing-based economy, not only did the economic complexity start thinning out and getting lost, but at the same time, there were these very radical interventions which actually destroyed some of the spatial complexity. So you had these kind of post-war planning interventions which created kind of inner city motorways, which destroyed whole tracts of terrace streets, which destroyed the urban grain in many places. And actually that destruction of complexity hasn't really been repaired. And it's not just the case for Manchester. I think also if you go to Newcastle, if you go to Sheffield, we're still living with the kind of, I suppose, the infrastructural relics of that kind of post-industrial, that kind of post-war top-down planning, which kind of undermined the kind of the way that the street structure can bring the economy to life and bring the social life of a city to life. So that was a long answer to a brief question.
So I'll perhaps just interject a comment, which is it seems that they have a clear interdisciplinary focus, combining economics with architecture or urban design, and perhaps you could talk about that, but perhaps later. I will first ask to hear from you in terms of key findings.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I found even just describing it then quite difficult, jumping from the economic to the spatial and back, because actually that's the trouble, I think, with doing interdisciplinary research, is that if you're trying to do something which brings together different disciplines, it becomes complicated explaining it. I suppose that's the problem with complexity. It's actually quite complicated to explain. But anyway, yeah, so in terms of my key findings, so I did actually, while I was doing the research, feed into Greater Manchester's industrial strategy. There was a lot of thinking going on at the time about, you know, how the city might evolve in the future. And through that process, I kind of developed some policy recommendations for the PhD and ultimately for the book. I didn't realise I was going to be doing that because I know actually when we give academic advice, we often say, don't finish your essay with policy recommendations. That's not what you're here for. But I ended up crystallising some ideas that actually, if you're a policymaker working in a city, first of all, I think you should observe. You should spend time observing. You should spend time looking at what the key latent potentials are within your system. What makes your place different from other places, and how far is that based on the historical evolution of a place? So to give an example of that, in Manchester, there's a real sort of emphasis at the moment on Manchester becoming a knowledge-based economy, a lot about culture and services, and maybe a bit of a turning back on manufacturing, actually, that maybe even though manufacturing was the past, this shouldn't be the future. I think Ed Glazer says that post-industrial cities should reinvent themselves completely and, tabula rasa, start again. Whereas I was wanting to say, and this is what my input into the strategy was, that actually all of these capabilities, this knowledge that's built up over a long time in both the machinery and the buildings and people's working processes, it can then be reused and readapted for new things. So in Manchester's case, it's long history in textiles and clothing and chemicals and plastics and rubber, and all these things can actually be pivoted to then maybe make that a centre of green diversification for the future. You don't need to move away from a materials-based economy just because you want to invest in knowledge-based services. So I think it's this thing of actually recognising the latent potentials within your own system, recognising the interdependencies and how space and the economy interact before you start intervening in a top-down way, maybe copying what other cities are doing, or imposing national policies without questioning quite how they're going to relate to your city.
Yeah, so as we're here for the Global South Teaching Week as part of our Masters, I will perhaps then ask you if you could speak to how some of these findings translate or can be adapted in different geographies. But let's leave that for the discussion time. And the final sort of structural bit of this first part of the presentation is the so what. You told us a bit about your findings. Can you discuss a bit this idea of so what, that the students sometimes, well, and ourselves quite often struggle to get to the real essence of what we are trying to get at when we do our research? Can you discuss a bit that?
I mean, it's funny because it started off as a very academic exercise, but actually the more I looked at how urban complexity becomes destroyed through certain processes, it actually ended up being a real plea. I sort of ended up getting more strident by the end of the book, I think, pointing out how people can, through kind of unintentional consequences of kind of top-down and slightly uninformed policy decisions, you can destroy these kind of, these pockets of complexity that the cities are. You can intervene in the wrong way. So I think on the one hand, I wanted to give an easy introduction to urban complexity. So I've got a whole chapter which kind of sets out the principles of systems theory and how you might apply that to cities, based actually quite a lot on some of our discussions over the last few years. And then I kind of set out how we might understand the interdependencies, but actually towards when I start looking at the kind of destruction and looking at how kind of this has affected our post-industrial cities, it really starts making me, I've kind of, ended up with this sort of plea, I suppose, to respect diversity more, complexity more, and to actually avoid these kind of unthoughtful interventions, both in urban space and in some cases in the economy, which don't respect what's already there. So I suppose it's going with what's there and the latent potentials in it, as opposed to just imposing models. And Jane Jacobs, I'm going to misquote her now, but she had this wonderful quote about the problem with paternalists is that they try to make impossibly profound changes with impossibly superficial measures, which I really like. I think sometimes you have to take quite a long time to understand how a system is working, to describe it effectively before you should, even think about intervening it. I think so incremental intervention is a good idea, but I still think maybe more dramatic intervention is needed in these post-industrial cities to get rid of these kind of relic infrastructures from the kind of post-war planning period, which are still, you know, strangling some city centres and preventing them from functioning as coherent whole.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're emphasizing something that I really enjoyed about the book, and I wrote on here on my little review, is that again you're focusing on bridging the theoretical with the practical, which is something that we discuss quite often, how, you know, the value that we both see in that, and that our students tend to see in that. And so I think you do that exceptionally well in this book. So with those first initial comments and to set up the tone, we will open the floor to the audience. If you want to ask any questions, we know you didn't read the book, but from this introduction, you might have perhaps questions. I see already a hand up. Vlad, please.
Got a few questions. I'll start with the easy one. And you know, we have students as well who are now developing dissertation ideas. One of the usual simple questions is how you've chosen your case study.
Yeah.
So why Newcastle, Sheffield, Detroit, New Haven? Why not Birmingham, something like Liverpool, etc., etc.? How did you make those selections?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I started on Manchester because that's where I did my PhD, and it was partly because I used to work at the OECD, where I was doing a lot of this travelling around and looking at policy interventions. And we ended up with my sort of last few months there, we ended up doing a big conference in Manchester. And I was talking to a lot of local policymakers, and I was also realising that Manchester had become this kind of poster child for devolution in the United Kingdom. This is where, you know, we were trying to build this northern powerhouse. We were trying to really change the game in terms of how agglomeration economies, or, you know, how cities were working in the UK, in the north. But I just had this unease again that it was not all about governance. I mean, it's good to have devolution, it really is, but I think it's also about really understanding what the potentials of a place are too, and I wanted to investigate that more scientifically. And the more I looked at Manchester, it was even more of a good case, actually, because it was the Industrial Revolution city. I mean, I know there are other cities that make that claim, but it was one of the first cities to really develop a kind of strong industrial economic base. And it's changed and diversified so much since that time, actually, but it's interesting to see how that has transformed. And this process of the evolution of complexity and then the destruction of complexity is common to these post-industrial cities like Sheffield and Newcastle and New Haven. And what's strange, I suppose, is it's not just an economic story. It's actually that in many of those cities, they've suffered the same fate of this sort of rather top-down spatial intervention at a certain point, perhaps to try and, you know, react to the economic decline. So they often share this kind of problem of this relic infrastructure that's still not really helping them to function as interconnected cities. So I found that even you could be criticised, I think, for just looking at one city. I'm sure you could. But actually, by going in depth and exploring it from these interdisciplinary angles and really tracing how things evolved, I found that there were these kind of principles that I could apply to other cities, which seem to also have a truth to them. So it's that trade-off, isn't it, between depth and transferability. I know you've got more questions. Yeah.
So I was wondering if these conclusions that you are and this way of analyzing these processes, but more importantly, the conclusions that you're taking can also be extrapolated to other types of cities where urban complexity has also been broken, but through a different process that maybe is not the post-industrial factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I can also talk a bit about this and the relevance for global south cities, which is the focus of our teaching week this week. Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of top-down master planning isn't unique, obviously, to the cities that I've looked at, and it's not necessarily a response to kind of industrial change. I think you often see that, we talked this week about Maghrebian architecture, didn't we, about the kind of Basim S. Hakim's work on how a lot of kind of self-organized, sort of incrementally grown cities create this wonderful urbanism, but it's not necessarily always respected or recognised for what it is. And so you get sort of people coming in and destroying swathes of cities to create, you know, order, to create economic functionalities without respecting some of these, you know, lovely complex neighbourhoods, really. So I think this destruction of complexity happens all over the place. I don't think it's unique to the cities that I looked at. And in terms of kind of the global South relevance, I mean, I haven't sort of intentionally looked at the relationship except to see that there are actually relationships between places like Manchester and all around the world because of extractive relationships, actually. So Manchester benefited a lot from colonial and slavery relationships and all sorts of, you know, relationships with cities and places around the world from where raw materials came to feed this industry that was developing. So you can't look at Manchester on its own. But at the same time, I think this idea of looking at the capabilities of a place and how they've evolved uniquely in complex relationships in a place is very transferable to anywhere, because I think, again, sometimes when you find people go in with ideas about development and economic development, social development that are born from other places, people again don't really bother to find out enough about what the particular potentials of a place are and how that had historically evolved. So again, it's a lack of observation of what's there and an imposition of something from outside, which is a problem in cities all over the world, I think.
Thanks, Francesca. Really interesting format, by the way. It's definitely piquing my interest to read the book, having this kind of pre-launch where you're sort of just giving us a little bit of information, but so much is behind this cover. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about your approach to scale, because I mean, you clearly worked at several different scales, and I mean, even methodologically, I'd be interested to hear how you kind of connected those up. And maybe it's part of the same question, or maybe it's a different question, but I'm also fascinated by the chapter 8, waterproofing. Okay.
Yeah, that's a really nice question. Thank you. Yeah, so one of the things that you talk about when you talk about systems theory is scale of resolution, or, you know, what scale are you going into a system to understand it? And it relates also to this part whole thing. So I was trying to get an idea of the whole. So looking at the whole economy of Greater Manchester and the relationships between the different economic communities I could see. So a whole with hierarchy, actually. And it was the same spatially. I was trying to get an idea of the kind of overall network of the city and how it was held together by this global kind of foreground network of streets. But to really understand what was going on, I then needed to zoom in. So economically, I kind of went from looking at the whole and then looking at the economic communities, then looking into textiles and clothing as one economic community that had lots of subsectors, but I could see relationships between that and the chemical sectors. And so I homed in on that. And then I ended up really homing down on waterproofing, which is the manufacture of raincoats, because what was really interesting in Manchester is that there'd been this branching industry, which started in about the 1820s when Charles Mackintosh went to Manchester and made the first raincoat using waste products from a gas industry to kind of, create this first kind of rainproof outerwear. But actually it branched over time into all sorts of different small companies, all sorts of different ways of doing waterproofing. It even ended up creating kind of rucksacks and leisure wear for people walking in the Pennines, in combination with people from Sheffield working on that. So it allowed me, by looking at that very small scale of economic focus, I could see that the chemicals and the textiles industries were working at this very small niche to create a really expanding industry. So that was useful. And then spatially, I started zooming in on a couple of different very local case study areas. So I looked at Strangeways in the north of the city and Altrincham, which is in the southwest of the city. And I was based in a school of architecture, so I did a kind of architectural ethnography as best I could, because I'm not really an architect. I trained as an anthropologist, so I was an imposter in the architectural world. But I went in and actually really mapped all the companies that were in this Strangeways area, which is a kind of fashion cluster, a fashion wholesale cluster, and looked at all the interrelationships between those companies. in Altrincham, I was looking more at, knowledge exchange and the different sorts of interrelationships between firms in that part of the city, and then understanding how they were related back to the rest of the city through their positioning, and also to the UK and international economy, actually, with the Strangeways cluster, because it was really well placed for products to come in and out, these wholesale firms. So it had a kind of vantage point within the city that was locally and internationally helpful, I think. So yeah, I played with scales quite a lot and found it a very useful thing to zoom in and out, and using similar themes, but at different scales of resolution.
Question. Thank you.
Someone?
No, I think Evelina. I think it's you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to reading it, and I think for the students that are in the room, please don't be scared by that massive.
I know, it's ridiculous.
Price tag. Thanks to our librarian Angela Carrot, who's here with us today. There is an ebook version online, which
Yes.
you can
Thank
read.
you very much.
While you're a student, obviously. But I wanted to ask, and I'm really happy that you said your training, the background was as an anthropologist, because I was thinking, as this looked like a book written by an architect that actually really wanted to understand the sociality of the city. But since you said that you trained originally as an anthropologist, I get a sense that you are an anthropologist that wanted to understand the materiality and the history of the city, a little bit the other way around. But as you know, and you mentioned, the oftentimes the teams that are assembled to do master plans are very siloed. And unfortunately, we are not afforded architects that really care about the anthropology of place, or economists that are really interested in the more physical, material aspect of how neighborhoods operate. So how do you think? And I think you already started telling us a bit about this. How do you think that practitioners who are involved in master planning in its different components, how could they use your book to ultimately make plans that master plans and other forms of policy making that help us develop better plans for the future?
Yeah, so in one of my kind of recommendations, I was saying that it doesn't have to rebuild complexity isn't necessarily a very complicated process. So I think a lot of times we hear about the science of cities, and particularly people involved in network analysis, and I do use quite a bit of network analysis in the first couple of chapters, will say that it's quite a complicated thing to learn how to intervene in cities. But actually, I'm very in favour, sort of following Bill Hillier, who's a big influence on this book, in actually understanding, looking from the past to understand how things can work again in the future. And one of the things you understand when you looking at Greater Manchester in its heyday, really, how well that structure, that spatial structure, worked to support a social, living, lively city. And it often gets criticised. I mean, following the work of Frederick Engels, it got very much criticised as being, this industrial, polluted, bad place. Whereas actually, I'm sure the housing conditions were terrible. And I think because of the exploitation of people in the workforce, there were some terrible conditions. But actually, when you look at the spatial structure and you measure it and you understand how it brought people together and would have supported movement and encounter and interaction, you realise how well it would have worked. And it's actually very simple in a way that cities work best as grids. I mean, it's about interconnectedness. It's about not channeling people off in directions that they're separated from each other. It's almost, to use a textiles analogy, it's actually sort of, it's a net. it's knitting something together so it functions as a whole. So I think you can kind of you can look at the historic cities, not because you want to learn from their aesthetics or, you know, make something look the same as it always looked. It's actually looking at historic cities to understand through network analysis or just simply through reading or understanding how these places work, to learn how we can keep building more sociable cities for the future and walkable cities for the future as well.
Hi, Francesca. Thank you, and congratulations. I was wondering how some of these complexities go beyond whatever you want to call urban. Of course, what is the city and what is urban? We could spend the rest of the evening talking about that, but the surroundings of it all and how that complexity interacts. And maybe as a way of approaching that topic, I'm particularly interested in chapter 10, how nature fits or something. Cities as systems of systems where nature fits in. And as a environmental engineer, also an imposter of some sorts wherever I am, but I'm particularly interested in those topics. Of course, from an air pollution perspective in my specific case, but you've touched upon some of the exploitation of materials also to build a city like Manchester. But I don't know, I feel that sometimes when we focus so much on the urban, we kind of forget how, or at least we neglect to recognize the importance that all of the other things have to happen so that the urban can actually happen the way that it happens. And I'm sure that your approach is useful to look at those complexities also. So
yeah, that's a nice question as well. When I did my PhD, I necessarily focused in, I could have focused a lot more actually. Anyway, I focused in on space and the economy to the exclusion of some other systems. So actually when I got the opportunity to do the book, it was wonderful to be able to then think broader actually and think about how nature-based systems might feed into all of this. I mean, systems theorists would say that any system is only partially closed, so you can only kind of draw an arbitrary boundary in a way about what you want to look at. When it comes to cities, I think there's been a lot of conversation about, you know, functional urban areas and how you set the boundary based on the built environment and the labour market. And there is some argument that you, especially with somewhere like Greater Manchester, because it has been defined as a commuting zone, as a functional urban area, there is some argument for looking at it on its own and looking at it as a whole and its constituent parts. But it was so clear doing the research that it was anything but an independent whole, as I've already touched on. I mean, products were coming in and out from everywhere around the world. People, I mean, it's a product of immigration, Manchester as well. People have come to Manchester and continue to come to Manchester from all over the place, bringing their skills and capabilities with them. So I think you again, coming back to scale, you also have to zoom in and zoom out to these kind of much broader relationships. And I think with nature-based infrastructure or thinking about natural systems, and I ended up exploring it in two different ways. First of all, I mean, it's interesting how cities can think about much more about their rural hinterlands and the fact that actually you end up with these kind of natural green infrastructures, which are so important for air quality, but also for water filtration, for all sorts of things that we've not really recognised we can get for free from the self-organising characteristics of nature. So that was one thing, but I also started getting into the idea of circularity and, you know, how we can actually reduce the kind of impact of these burgeoning city economies on nature. And actually, I started off assuming, like I think a lot of people do, that, you know, somewhere like Manchester is a terrible example of being a kind of fossil capital that's, you know, always used all of these kind of fossil fuels, and it's had a very bad impact on the planet through the production that it encouraged. But actually, if you look back at Manchester in its kind of heyday again, it was a very circular, lattice-based economy. Actually, a lot of the waste products of different industries went in as raw materials into other industries. There was a lot of circulation of materials within the system, sharing of resources. In fact, they used every little bit of anything they could possibly use for profit, really. But it meant that actually we've lost sight of some of that. Actually, how cities. The interdependence in cities can also be around, you know, keeping energy usage a bit lower by sharing products and raw materials and being circular. So it was quite useful when I did the book to start thinking about what I'd done for the PhD from a different angle and think about other things I could draw out from my research.
I would like to know how long did it take to because you mentioned that you finished the PhD in 2021. I would like to know the process of writing and the end.
Yeah, that's a good question. I did take a bit of a break, so I advise you if you end up wanting to publish your master's dissertations or PhDs, that actually it's probably quite a good idea just to leave it on the leave it on the table for quite a while and see what happens. Because actually, I sort of a year later, I had a kind of complete rejig of the structure. So how I'd structured it in the PhD, I thought was okay at the time. And then when I looked at it again, I realized it just didn't make sense. So I restructured it completely. So I think that benefited from that pause. And then, yeah, so I suppose I really started, it probably took me about a year and a half to kind of make the book, I suppose. Is that right? Probably, maybe a bit more. Writing very early in the morning generally, and trying to keep that kind of nice writing space, which I miss now. Actually, there's a real pleasure in just writing and something that you care about. It's a kind of different exercise than other sorts of work, I think.
And it's incredibly efficient for 1 year and a half.
Well, maybe you see some of it was already there in the PhD. But
Still,
yeah.
Okay, couple of go from the moment first, and then
Just related to that, now that you have a gift of hindsight, what do you think you would have done differently to get to this stage, do you think?
I don't know if I could have done anything differently. Actually, one of the last cohort of students, Meta Dell, said this really useful thing to me at some point last year, where I was just thinking, this is a mountain. I'm never gonna do this. Why did I think I was going to do it? And she said, the only way is through. And it was really helpful, because actually it really was. It's just an incremental process of plugging away at it. And I'm not sure I could have done it really differently. But I was quite glad I was doing all sorts of other things at the same time, because it just meant that I kept having the distance from it in a way. I didn't get overwhelmed by it.
I guess a slight follow-up to that question, particularly with something like systems theory and complexity, you could go on and the next thing and add things. How did you come to the conclusion that you were happy with the bounds of what it was that you wanted to sort of communicate?
That's a good, yeah. I mean, in a way, I wanted it to be a simple book about complexity, which is crazy, isn't it? But I mean, it's funny because it's ended up it's a very expensive academic book. But actually, I was sort of writing something for a broader audience, I realise now. I wanted to write something which was fairly short, which was fairly simply written, so that people could negotiate it and it could learn from it. And it had some technical stuff in it, but it actually told a kind of narrative which was absorbable quite quickly. And I think, as you say, once you get into complexity, you could probably go even much deeper. But at some point, I think you have to think about the narrative you want to construct and who you want to reach. I mean, in the end, I was quite shocked by how short it actually was. So there you go. It's a very short book, but I think at least it means it's readable. So,
Letitia, and then there was another hand on the back. So.
But following up on these questions, I was wondering what kind of took you to make the decision of writing the book?
I mean, yeah, so when I finished the PhD, funnily enough, there was a very influential moment, because there was somebody who used to work with Bill Hillier in the Space Syntax Lab at UCL, who wrote the most beautiful PhD. If anybody is interested in the historic evolution of the City of London, that is a wonderful PhD to read. And I drew so much on her PhD, actually, in this book, in other writings that I've done, and she never published it. So it's this kind of, nobody knows it's there. It's this wonderful account full of richness and thought. And I just kind of vowed to myself, actually, that at the end of the PhD, I would try and publish, because I didn't want to be in the same situation. I think there are still people who are encouraging Julian Hanson to publish her PhD. But I think the trouble is, when you finish your PhD, and it might well be the same with masters, it's so easy just to get absorbed on other things and not realise that you need to get what you've done out there somehow.
There was a hand at the background.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think it's linked. It's just I'm curious. In the academic world, it's always should I publish journal articles or should I publish books? And each time you ask a professor or an academic, the answer is so different.
Yeah,
So I just wanted to
yeah.
know your stance on.
I mean, I was always advised not to write a book. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that when you write academic articles, it's even easier for people to absorb that information, and it's much more. I mean, the last 2 articles I've written have been open source, which is fantastic. So anybody around the world can read it quickly, and but there's something very satisfying about writing a book. I mean, it's almost sounds a bit pretentious, but it's almost like a part-whole relationship again, because it's like I'd been thinking all these things for quite a long time. And having them in sort of fragmented articles wasn't enough. I kind of wanted to bring it together into something whole. So, I mean, what worries me now is I hope people will be able to read it, because it won't be, you know, out there and promoted as much as an article will be. But I think the actual process of writing a book is a very nice one to go through.
So I'm conscious of time. We have drinks in the common room next, and we hope to see you all there. I don't know if you wanted to just wrap up the session. Is there something you would like to say to sort of conclude the session?
Well, just coming back to the start, I just wanted to thank you all for all the support that you gave me. I mean, students, but also colleagues in the room who've just made it a real pleasure the last few years working in such a supportive academic setting. And I think that also helped me to write a book that I'm very pleased with. So, so thank you to you all, basically.
Okay, so thank you so much. Congratulations once again. It's a brilliant book. Thank you.